Who doesn't blame the media when things go wrong? The right wing talks about the lamestream media to such an extent that entire careers and incomes, see Brent Bozell and Bernard Goldberg, are built on the self-evident fiction that companies owned by big corporations are biased to the left. Progressives, in turn, blame the corporate media when their candidate or cause fails. Both can't be right. Everyone loves and quotes Thomas Jefferson's encomium that if he had to choose a government without the press, you know it, or a press without the government, he'd go with the press, which is understandable hyperbole from our founding. Remember that the Federalist was serialized in New York, I don't know if you personally remember, was serialized by New York papers in 1787, providing the cornerstone of a country and very presciently an award-winning play 230 years later. In 1860, Lincoln's speeches, especially at Cooper Union, were reprinted around the country and read by as high a percentage or higher than today are on Facebook. Hence, he wins the nomination and the presidency. In 1953, Edward R. Murrow stirred the nation to finally go after McCarthy. And I'm not going to be partisan, but that raises the question, where is 2016's Murrow defrocking you-know-who? Notwithstanding the phenomenal rise of social media, which is great as it is a largely, for now, self-selecting process. Today, the distribution is different from the Federalist to Murrow. It's filtered through a handful of major corporations who have a dog in the fight. News Corp, Time Warner, Comcast, Reuters, Bloomberg, Disney, Viacom, Hachette. They control what most Americans read, not all, but most. This is precisely what Lewis Powell suggested and intended in his now famous Powell Memo of 1971, targeting Ralph and all critics of business. He correctly, sadly, but correctly saw that the corporate media was to be an instrument of corporate power. This is not what the founders intended. Bill Moyers, who, in my view, with Ralph Nader, is one of the two great progressive public intellectuals of our era, said, quote, "The First Amendment is the first for a reason, to hold our representatives accountable and to arm the powerless with information, to stand up to the tyranny of the elite, political or economic. The founders, however, did not count on the rise of the mega media," close quote. So instead of information flowing freely and without bias, news now, in the phrase of James Hamilton of Duke University, is, quote, "a commodity, not a mirror image of reality," close quote. But private mega media firms curating public information has its own bias, just as we don't allow batters to call balls and strikes. It's timely that Breaking Through Power dedicates a full day on the media. Preliminarily, let's me acknowledge what we all sort of know. There's no such thing as, Sarah Palin's epithets notwithstanding, the media. That piñata includes Breitbart to The Nation, Fox to the New York Times, and thousands of others, big and small. Still, it's reasonable and factual to make some observations on how well the media in general has performed during the crises affecting our economy and our democracy. Here's one measure of the failure at the risk of playing up to my friend and our host. How could it be that one person, a no-name lawyer out of Connecticut, who metastasized into thousands of Ralph Naders, was the one to blow the whistle on scores of subjects, not just auto safety, over the past 50 years? from food safety to pension rights, educational testing, antitrust, regulation, and nuclear safety. Let's examine 3 assertions concerning the mass media to understand why we cannot depend on it to give it to us straight. Axiom 1, the media, of course, is biased to the left. It's almost axiomatic, right? Without need of evidence. I'm sure that amuses and is news to Rupert Murdoch, who, unlike me so far, owns the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, Fox, and assorted others. I'm sure it's news to the 80% of newspapers that endorse Reagan, Bush 41, Bush 43, and Mitt Romney, you know, the liberals in those races. I'm sure it's news given how the major media for decades have operated almost entirely around the conservative paradigm that trade is always good, that we always need lower taxes, debt is awful, if accumulated by Democrats, and federal spending, of course, correlates with higher inflation. This was thought as the dominating only paradigm until September 17th, help me, 2001, when Occupy Wall Street occupied not only a space, but the mental space in America, and we're still living with it, happily, in the politics of 2016. If anything, there's a bias toward corporate conservatism. The threat or the reality of pulled advertising, make sure a publication and journalists know who butters their bread as if they didn't. Advertising has its privileges. When a journalist, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for the LA Times in 2006, wrote a piece that the heads of the auto companies should be brought up on impeachment charges, GM, as is its legal financial right, pulled a promised $3 million in advertising from the LA Times. Message delivered. Ownership has its privileges. We all remember A.J. Liebling's comment that everyone's entitled to freedom of the press, especially if they own one. Ask Sheldon Adelson in Las Vegas. Of course, who hires and fires? Who decides on the editorial board, editorial head of the page, editorials? Not the union, if there is one, not readers, not activists. Of course, it's management and the owners. Some examples. Phil Donahue at MSNBC in 2003 during the run-up and the launch of the Iraq invasion and occupation was told, look, you're such a big liberal, you have to have on 2 conservatives every time there's 1 liberal because you count as 2 liberals. And he saw the handwriting on the wall when Tucker Carlson, the bow tie, was hired. And eventually it was quite clear that this MSNBC then thought he was too unpatriotic, that is, not pro-Bush enough, and he was eased off the air, except, notwithstanding, that he was the highest rated show then on MSNBC. And it would be funny, if it weren't tragic at the same time, that Newsweek exposed Colin Powell's falsehoods about WMD before the UN. Then the Bush administration attacked Newsweek for using anonymous sources. Of course, the war was launched by an anonymous source, this is his name, called Curveball, who made it up and is the basis of all the essential justification for going into Iraq. A lot of this traces back to the syndrome that Mark Herstegard wrote about a decade before under Ronald Reagan, on bended knee. How supine the White House corralled press corps is, every day having to be spun by and speak in front of the president and his people. Now, it is probably true that most journalists voted for Obama, then Romney, for Kerry over Bush. That doesn't mean that they tilt the news. Everybody has beliefs. Maybe they do tilt the news. Maybe others tilt the news. But that has not been shown. And I believe in the magic of the marketplace. If people want to go into journalism, they had better be people who have an inclination toward open-mindedness, accuracy, and evidence, not catechism and shibboleths. So if more people are attracted to journalism because they're, as I stipulate, more open-minded, don't be surprised at the result. Is that prejudicial and self-satisfying? I believe I'd win an argument that one side in this conversation is tolerant and fact-based, maybe wrong, but tolerant and fact-based, and the other side reverses the scientific method. So instead of facts leading to conclusions, conclusions lead to facts. As you know, believing is seeing. Notwithstanding these facts, sad to report, the right wing both has an undue influence over the mainstream media and at the same time has won the public argument that the media is liberal. This is nice work if you can do it, and they have so far. It shows that if you say something untrue often and loudly and consistently enough, Fox, Fair and Balanced, you can create your own reality for a while. But in the long term, if truth has the same space and ground as error, wrote Franklin, truth will prevail. The problem, though, is advertisers and owners work the refs, R-E-F-S. That is Eric Alterman's very insightful metaphor and analysis in his best-selling book, What Liberal Media? And so if the right wing is constantly yelling at the over-the-air major media, the people who run that can get nervous. For example, see This Week with George Stephanopoulos on Sunday mornings. They have had as a regular Bill Kristol, who has been called, when it comes to politics and facts, a reverse Geiger counter. If something is true, you know it if he says the opposite. And the examples are too long, and it would take the rest of the afternoon, and because it certainly can't be his charming electronic personality that gets him on. CBS has two examples of this, which I discuss in my book. They pulled the documentary with major actors called The Reagans in 2002 because it wasn't all puffery. It discussed how they ignored and pulled their punches until 20,000 Americans had died of AIDS. I think no Americans have yet died of Ebola here. And of course, there was a tremendous sky is falling panic. 20,000, not a word. Second, of course, the Dan Rather story on Bush and the Air Force and being AWOL was true, had a major source that was compromised, mistake, and it was true. And of course, the victim was not Bush, but rather, as the movie Truth with Robert Redford conveyed. Axiom 2, right-wing talk radio is popular because they're just better at it. I will tell you, Rush Limbaugh is very good at what he does is unlike television when you're at home and the kids are yelling and you're cooking and you're talking. And when you're in a car listening to radio, it's the speaker and you. He's talking to you. I don't know how many of you have seen, but I recommend you get it on Amazon. Who Brainwashed My Dad? Jen Senko, S-E-N-K-O. Who? I wish the media would same time fact check Donald Trump. I have just been fact checked, and the title of the film, I was completely wrong. The Brainwashing of My Dad. Okay. I saw it, it's very good, and to summarize, This director and producer had a father who was a loving, normal guy, like the Kennedys. Suddenly she was watching how he was getting cranky, attacking feminazis, liberals who control the media, and they finally figured out, to and from his commute to work, he would listen on the radio for hours on end, cumulatively, to Rush Limbaugh. There are entire stretches of America where you can only listen to Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Michael Savage, all the Savages. 9 out of the top 10 talkers are right-wing. Partly, it's here the consolidation I mentioned before is pronounced. Clear Channel, Cumulus, Sinclair, Salem own some 90% of all programs distributed in America. Let me say, Clear Channel, which became Premier, which is now called iHeartRadio, is trying. And to balance, they do distribute Rush, Sean, and Glenn Beck. They do distribute both sides now on weekends, which is a rounding error in Rush Limbaugh's royalties, but they're trying. Now, this happened after, causally or coincidentally, but it happened after Ronald Reagan ended the Fairness Doctrine in 1988 on the understanding that while you can't regulate the price of haircuts, I like A, I like B, I wait longer, I do it myself, public information over the public airwaves is, as indicated, essential to a functioning democracy. Imagine if the publicly owned highways allowed only conservative HOV lanes and the minorities had to go on side roads. That would be a joke, but it's what's happening. Air America. I was involved in the rise and then later in the descent. I was its last president of Air America Radio. And for what? First of all, Limbaugh people say, oh, that he's just more talented. Let me tell you, as a legacy, was there a more talented combination of people since Jefferson dined alone at the White House than Rachel Maddow, Al Franken, and Marc Maron? Think about that lineup. FYI, I'm constantly asked, why did it fail when right-wing works? When you start with a deep pocket like Rupert Murdoch to sustain you during the lean years until you find your audience, that's good. Air America didn't have one. The older white guys who run ad agencies, GM, for example, advertising, they kind of don't like anti-war liberals, I found out painfully. 3, a lot of large companies and networks have no-buy lists, no, B-U-Y, lists, where they, and I have the memos, they send it to advertisers and stations saying, you are not to run advertising on Air America stations. And finally, and this is interpretive, but I really believe it, I don't know how many of you saw Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous, one second, what was the name of it, miss? Righteous People, oh, The Righteous Mind. He said that it's almost chromosomal or genetic. Some people have a chemistry that they just like. Hierarchy, the army, the clergy, ditto heads, and other people embody what Robert Frost once joked as the definition of a liberal is someone who won't take his own side in a debate. The combination is then that talk radio is completely dominated by one side of the ideological framework. Axiom 3, Fox TV, again, they're just more entertaining with better graphics than the competition. Well, that could be true. Let me talk about Fox in the 3 minutes and 6 seconds I have remaining, and then the conclusion. Bear with me. During the spring of 2011, Harold Camping, an octogenarian preacher and Christian broadcaster, grabbed headlines for pinpointing the precise date of the rapture, May 21st, 2011. His followers quit their jobs and donated their savings to spread the word on thousands of billboards, and some even retreated into the mountains to await the day. But when it passed and the earth remained intact, a humbled Camping threw in the towel. I mean, there was the evidence. And announced he would no longer be in the business of prophecy. This is not a story that worries Fox News. For while Camping finally acknowledged that truth has consequences, the cable channel has rewritten Love Story's famous 70s axiom, Fox means never having to say you're sorry, close quote. So whenever anything happens, and Fox has 100 segments on Benghazi, is Obama's Watergate. Hurricane Sandy is Obama's Watergate. Ebola is Obama's Watergate. When nothing happens to sustain that, they move on and say, oh, did you see that Michelle spent $200 million on a trip with her daughters to Southeast Asia? That was a big narrative for a while. Equally untrue. I don't have to educate you about Fox, but let me give you just two very personal examples. The last time I was on Bill O'Reilly, he once a year has a thing, a war on Christmas. He means war on Christians, but okay, he calls it a war on Christmas. And so he had me on, and I knew what to expect. He thought this Jew would say, we don't want creches in public places because separation of church and state, but it's okay to have a menorah. He asked me the question, and I go, it's okay to have neither. Because you don't, a menorah may be a secular object, but it's sort of emblematic of the Jewish holiday. And so he should have neither. The next day, he went on his show and said, quote, I thought Mark Green was a good guy, but what a hypocrite. He said we shouldn't allow creches, but we should allow menorahs. I contacted the producer. I said, he has to correct this. And then he said, well, Bill had a different interpretation of what you said. I said, like, no is yes? What kind of interpretation is that? Next, right after Sandy Hook, I said, gee, if we have registries of sexual predators, we should have registries of gun ownership. Who has a gun permit? Quickly, I got called by Hannity's producer to go on. I knew what to expect. He said, are you equating sexual predators with gun owners? I said, no. One has committed a crime, and the other is doing something lawful. But don't you want to know if Adam Lanza is living next to you, who's a bit strange, has access to a gun? And he went into a big thing about, did you know, Mark, that George Washington said that rifles and pistols are equally indispensable, quote, they deserve a place of honor with all that's good, close quote. In that instant, I didn't know that because Washington never said it. A Washington scholar said it's a made-up quote. So when it turns out, when Frank Rich raised an interesting issue, why are we spending our time on the left attacking Fox? Not even another minute and a half. When they just 3 million listeners tops in a country of 320 million, the answer is they poison the well of democracy. They make Republican candidates lurch to the right, be it local or for president. With the huge impact, they have made it more likely that the House and the Senate are Republican. Gerrymandering, Wyoming has as many senators as California because of the original Connecticut Compromise. But less likely, 5 out of 6 of the last presidential popular votes, have gone against the Republican nominee. So Fox, be careful what you wish for. 3 conclusions in a few sentences. One, the most important people in American journalism are not Chuck Todd or Arthur Sulzberger. It's the no-name producer at the evening news shows who decides what gets on. And as the Fox people run 100 segments that Hillary will be indicted, or whatever it is, that Michelle spent $200 million, she or he has to decide to let it break into the mainstream media or keep it isolated on the right. We're going to see that about whether the Clintons killed Vince Foster again this week, which the Republican nominee has implied. Second, and this is not a partisan comment, Bernie Sanders along with Elizabeth Warren and Ralph Nader and a lot of other people, are showing there is a natural progressive majority in America. You wouldn't know it by reading the mainstream media. The reality, which we're going to see this November again for the 6th of 7 presidential elections, is the center is liberal. It's not split 50-50. Chris Matthews is wrong. It's not a 45-45 country. It's a 50-45 country if you count voter registration and counting leaners and looking at recent votes and looking at the demography of it. So I've had it with the ethic that, of course, Ann Coulter's books get an audience, but not Bob Kuttner's. And finally, I look to John Nichols, who's speaking later today, who knows more about this than I do. What solutions are? There's no solution like letting 18-year-olds vote. There's nothing that simple. The big solution is better education. Because if you're dumb about issues or uneducated, you're going to buy some of the stuff that's being sent. The fairness doctrine could be recalibrated and reintroduced, tougher cross-media ownership. The FEC could require a rule requiring the source of financing of ads so the public can judge who is spinning them. And I want to thank Ralph Nader and et cetera for this citizen summons. And so you all should go home and summons the top people at your TV, radio stations, and newspapers to answer why there's a tilt against local news or any political bias. See who shows up. But I have good news. If you are a believer in the marketplace, millennials voted 3-1 for Obama. They're nearly 2-1 registering as Democrats. They're much more liberal than others. And as they mature and read and learn on their tablets rather than newsprint, I hope that the people who run the media, who want to treat it as a commodity, go where their readers are. We are entering a more progressive era, and I hope the major media act on it.
Now we have a panel of 3 really excellent guests. First, Eugene Jarecki, who's one of the top documentary filmmakers in the country. He's covered a wide variety of issues: Henry Kissinger, Ronald Reagan, the drug war, military wars, and they're all excellent. If you ever get a chance to see a Jarecki film, make sure you do. Laura Flanders of The Laura Flanders Show, which you can see anytime on lauraflanders.com. She does in-depth interviews of people who are working on these kinds of issues, the kind of interviews that we don't get enough of in the media, and she's been doing it for quite a while, and she's quite good at that. And finally, Jim Narekis, who has, since 1990, been writing and editing the bi-weekly newsletter Extra, which comes from Fairness and Accurate Reporting, and it's a newsletter that's a criticism of the media. Please, let's have all of our speakers come out.
The idea that democracy is threatened by a mass media owned by for-profit corporations and mostly funded by corporate advertisers is not a new concern. It goes back before the beginning of broadcasting. Jepton Sinclair's 1919 press expose, The Brass Check, if not earlier. When radio was just getting started, there were concerns that commercialism and control by wealthy owners would limit the information and ideas available to the citizenry. And when television arose as an even more powerful medium, the plea was redoubled that there ought to be, at the least, a parallel system that was not controlled by what we did not yet call the 1%, that was not beholden for its resources to giant corporations who see programming mainly as scaffolding for their billboards. And thus was born the American system of public broadcasting, what we've come to know as PBS for television and NPR for radio, though of course there are other institutions involved. This system was formed, in the words of the Carnegie Commission that provided the blueprint, to provide a voice for groups in the community that may otherwise be unheard, serve as a forum for controversy and debate, and to help us see America whole in all its diversity. It was a great idea, and if it had succeeded, it's an open question as to whether any of us would be here today if there really were a robust, truly public media in the United States to cover what's not being covered, to ask the questions that media conglomerates and the corporate advertisers don't want to ask. Would there really be a need for a national conference to break through to the media? Unfortunately, that kind of public media is not what we got, and the promise went unfulfilled by design. It was understood from the beginning that what public media needed to be truly independent was independent financing, a flow of resources that could not be turned off by either corporate or government elites. But because such independence was feared, public broadcasting was prevented from getting a dedicated, untouchable funding mechanism. Instead, public broadcasting was to be funded through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which had to return regularly to Congress to ask for money. Its board is appointed by the US president, providing another mechanism for political control. While in theory, it's supposed to act as a heat shield, protecting public stations and programmers from political pressure, from the very beginning it played the opposite role, with Richard Nixon stacking the deck with loyalists who at one point voted to cut off all funding for PBS News and public affairs programming. Over the years, pressure from Congress and from the White House via CPB appointees has alternated as the chief mechanism for keeping public broadcasting in line. Scrutiny of every broadcast that could be read as a challenge to official orthodoxy became a ritual of CPB reauthorization. Deficit-cutting zealots would threaten to zero out funding for public broadcasting, met with demands to save Big Bird, and fervent promises from public broadcasting executives not to air any programming that would offend right-wing Congress members' sense of fairness and balance. As James Ledbetter wrote in his History of Public Broadcasting, the taxpayer subsidy has repeatedly been used as a club. Like a dog that has learned to flinch at the mere pantomime of its master's lashing, public broadcasters know how to avoid topics and methods of criticism that might bring down the hand of rebuke. Opponents of independent public broadcasting were never really going to cut off funding entirely. They knew that the government leash was much too valuable as a tool of control. But they also knew that the government leash was not sufficient to ensure ideological safety, which is why they made sure that the government subsidy would never be enough to allow public broadcasting to operate without additional income from corporate sponsors, who in the world of public TV and radio are generally referred to by the euphemism underwriters. Now, the party line from the public broadcasting establishment is that this corporate money would never ever affect their programming. They never seem to notice that this claim, taken seriously, would negate the central rationale for setting aside part of the broadcast spectrum for non-commercial broadcasting in the first place. The fact is, if anything, sponsors have more power at so-called public TV than at the for-profit networks, because it's very difficult to get anything on the air on public TV unless a corporation is willing to not only put up the money for it, but also allow its brand to be identified with it. This is a big part of the reason that there's a nightly business report on public TV, produced by CNBC, which is to say Comcast, but no nightly labor report, no nightly consumer report, no nightly environmental report, nothing in short that would be likely to produce a sustained critical look at corporate America. Another reason for that is that public broadcasting stations, TV and radio, in enthusiastic pursuit of getting the largest amount of money from the smallest number of people, have basically been putting seats on their board up for sale. Since the boards legally control the stations, this is in effect public broadcasting putting itself up for sale. And the sale is virtually complete. A 2014 FAIR study of the boards of major public TV stations found that 84% of board members had corporate backgrounds, either working as executives for elite businesses or on the board by virtue of a corporate family fortune. A follow-up study in 2015 revealed that 75% of board members of leading public radio stations likewise belong to the corporate world. The result of all this is a public broadcasting system that functions more as a public relations vehicle for corporate America. That's why PBS Nova can air a program on the wonders of drone technology that's paid for by Lockheed Martin, a major drone manufacturer, and why Public Radio International can air a program on how great natural gas is. Natural gas will do everything we want it to do, is a direct quote. That was funded by Qatar, a major exporter of liquefied natural gas. And why it's okay for NPR's Morning Edition to cover the passage of Fast Track, paving the way for the TPP and TTIP, by interviewing 3 corporate lobbyists and no one else. But apart from the specific services that public broadcasting provides to particular corporate interests, the broader PR role it plays is for the corporate media system itself. Are you unsatisfied with the news and debate you're getting from the handful of media conglomerates that control our public discourse? Well, here's a totally different system that happens to be funded by the same corporations, managed by the same corporate elite, beholden to the same government officials, whose agendas are promoted by commercial media. But other than that, it's totally different. The primary function of public broadcasting as it currently exists is to serve as a decoy media, to distract people from our anti-democratic media by providing the illusion of an alternative. Public media is a great idea, and we still ought to try it sometime. But in the meantime, we've got to build our own network of truly independent media, community radio stations, alternative magazines, web-based news sites to do the job public broadcasting was created to do, to provide a voice for the voiceless and to reflect America in all its diversity.
Jim, how many of you subscribe to Extra? Now, how many of you are going to subscribe to Extra now that you've heard the kind of great stuff that's in it? How many of you support your local independent media outlet, whether it's a community radio station or a Pacifica station or something like that? How many of you subscribe to a podcast and actually contribute money? Good for you. What's wrong with the rest of you? All right, just asking. I want to say it's a great honor to be here and to be participating in this great event. And I want to celebrate and give thanks for the women who have sung in this room. Patti Smith, who has the power. And also remember one woman who was not allowed to sing in this room, Marian Anderson. We have come a bit of a way. We have made some distance, some journey. I do a program that I hope helps to fill the vacuum that Jim has so brilliantly identified. And I think I can do nothing more sort of succinct than to play a quick promo reel of that show to give you a sense of what the Laura Flanders Show is. You can find it online at lauraflanders.com, also at Link TV, Free Speech TV, and as a podcast. It's available at Telesur. Let's roll the tape. It's only 2.5 minutes long.
Too many media outlets turn away the most important stories. I started the Laura Flanders Show because we need a different sort of media. What would our world look like if our news showed us as much collaboration as it does competition? What if we got to meet people making change right here, right now, in all sorts of ways we're usually told are impossible?
What does structural racism look like in this country?
So much of how we've been socialized to be human is to resist change, to try to create these institutions to take over everything.
People are now beginning to question our entire system.
We don't have the state, we don't have the prisons, we don't have the cops, thank God. What we do have is the wild queer feminists of color decolonial imagination.
Each week on the Laura Flanders Show, I get to sit down with the smartest thinkers and doers of our time. Forward-thinking people you know, and others you'll want to know. I'm interested in what's going wrong and also what's going right. Meet the people and the movements who are pioneering better ways of living in tune with our ecosystem and each other, and find out how you can help.
Modern capitalist enterprise is the negation of democracy.
Climate change changes everything. We are in for dramatic physical change to our world, one way or another.
We have to see this as a global movement. We can't see our issues as just domestic issues.
The Laura Flanders Show also features exclusive investigative reporting.
What are the systemic issues that result in a young man being murdered?
We want our community to be reinvested in, but we want to be at the table. We want to be decision makers.
I knew what Katrina did here was a result of a natural disaster. What I saw out there was a man-made disaster.
There's all kinds of amazing prison abolitionist work going on, and divestment is just one part of that.
We young, we strong, we marching all day long.
It's one tactic that's a part of a much broader movement.
You can't stop the revolution! You can't stop the revolution!
And provocative commentary.
And I think women are in the forefront of the struggle against sacrifice zones because women know a thing or two about being sacrificed.
The Laura Flanders Show, weekly on Telesur, Link TV, MNN, and Free Speech TV.
It's gonna be ending with us winning, you already know. This time we get it and go get 'em off their body, baby. This time we gon' bust the ceiling. Oh, 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 oh.
Thank you. I saw a sign as I was leaving today, also traveling by train. I wish I had been in the same carriage as Patti Smith. It was an advertisement for a new series that apparently is coming to television. It has something to do with the apocalypse, I think. But the slogan was, or the advertising line was, "The beginning is nigh." And I thought, that is the most systematically excluded story of our time. Not the apocalypse part, but the beginning part. I happen to believe that one of the most consistent facets or functions of our money media is to keep us from the good news. We get a certain amount of the bad news. What we don't hear is the change that is being made. And when we do see or get confronted with obvious examples of people doing things we were told they couldn't possibly do, like someone like Bernie Sanders getting 7 million votes, we're kind of told, well, this is a phenomenon that's happening on the right, it's happening on the left, it's all equivalent. You know, Ralph may have 30,000 people at his, Bernie, as Ralph did, may have 30,000 people at his rallies, but Trump has big rallies too. There are 5,000 people at many of Trump's rallies that have gotten more coverage than Bernie. Outside of the question of the kinds of grassroots change that we cover on our program, because another message that we get from our media is that the only politics that matters is electoral politics, and that simply isn't true when you look at what changes things in America. The other message that we get is that progressives and people on the left don't really care about electoral politics or aren't good at it, and that the electoral system is ossified and unchangeable. Well, if you look across, and the final message that we get is that we live in an isolated island separate from the rest of the world. That what is happening in Greece and Spain and France and Ireland and England and Italy couldn't possibly have any relationship to what is happening here. But if you look around the world, you see on the left not just the rise of insurgent candidates within established parties like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party in England, but you see in the last 5 or 6 years the creation of something like 5 left parties, political parties, some like Syriza that have taken power, some like Podemos in Spain that are poised to take power, some like the Five Star movement in Italy that has made a major difference to this debate, if not the policies coming out of that country, and some like where I just was in Ireland, an anti-austerity alliance that is electing people to some of the most ossified bodies of government you can find. There were 2 candidates for the anti-austerity alliance elected to the Northern Irish Assembly just a few weeks ago. Did you hear any of that news? No. So I think when we talk about what is systematically ignored, we need to realize that, yes, the bad news is underreported, but the good news is barely reported at all. And while the beginning, I think, may be taking a long while in coming, and we have a long while still to go, what if we lived, as Patti Smith would have us live, with the sense that we could be at a beginning that is nigh, that we could have power to make the kind of change that Ralph Nader has shown us that we can make. Think of what happens every election year. We're told once every 4 years that we can make a difference, right? We're told that our vote counts, that we can change our environment, we can change the way our communities are organized. We're told we can do that through voting. And then we are told to sit back and let our elected officials represent us for the next 4 or 8 years. We need to turn that around and say, as Jean-Bertrand Aristide of Haiti said, that democracy elections aren't a sign of democracy, they just take the temperature of democracy. What is democracy is what happens all year round. And we need media that cover movements that put people in the picture of our change making, not once every 4 years as they vote for somebody else and cast their eyes upward praying for a leader that will save them, but every day can make changes in their communities and make the kind of change that has brought us to a situation where we can have this forum here today in the very hall that Marian Anderson was excluded from half a century ago. I think the beginning is maybe on its way. I think even better than that, I think we're in the middle of it. We need a media that reflects that. And unfortunately, it's not going to be paid for by the people and the corporations that bring us the way things are now. It's going to be paid for by us who want to see this change. So if you haven't paid your pledge to the media that supports you, please do it now. Thanks.
It's a pleasure to be here and a huge honor to be at anything Ralph tells me to do, I do, because I think we understand that despite the malignant efforts of the Democratic Party to pretend away their own shortcomings as having had anything to do with Ralph Nader is a hero in American life. There are 1 or 2 people in our minds that come anywhere close, and in very trying times, his capacity to gather us is of such beautiful value, and I'm thrilled to be able to think out loud with everybody here. I confess to being at a time of my life where the questions are outstripping the answers for me. The volume of everyday life, the new issues that we take on every day. Ralph brought to my attention some years ago the idea that in the modern era, one of the great vulnerabilities we have in a busier and busier time is just the sheer volume of obscenity that's thrown at us, sheer volume of transgressions against human dignity, regressive steps away from the Enlightenment. They come at us in battalion, not as spies, and it keeps you juggling to keep up. And so I confess to a certain measure of confusion at the world in front of me as a media maker, but I'll do my best at least to share some of the fragments of my thinking as I look at both the national life as it relates to the global life, and then also the media life as it relates to those two. I think it's a seismic time we're living in, and I think we have to recognize that we've gone almost sleepwalking into the future in a way. We walked from a past in which it had taken centuries and centuries to fashion standardized norms about conduct, particularly about governance and about the relationship between systems of power and people. And it took quite a lot to get to the place we got to, and the Enlightenment bears an enormous honor in having sort of been the pinnacle of that process. We now find ourselves hearing more and more very anti-Enlightenment thinking. And I think what's happening there is that as we spent all that time to get to that place, which was ever a work in progress, this country was broken from the start by genocide and by slavery and by the oppression of a wide range of rights of those who weren't white males. We still were a work in progress. Somebody said to me a few days ago, oh, it was always crappy. I don't know where you get the idea that it was once so great. And I said, well, I don't know if it was once so great, because I'm well aware of the genocide and the slavery and the oppression, but I'm aware that the trajectory, that arc of history that King talked about, it was directed toward progress. We are seeing a process that did begin with global slavery, and while we will hear that there are more slaves in the world today than at any other time in human history, the idea of slavery was made pariah. It is unthinkable now that a woman would be dragged by her hair. It's unthinkable. So many things that once couldn't happen are now a reality, down to having a person of dark complexion in the White House. And so I have to say, back to the cynic, yes, it was broken, but it was a work in progress. Where you reach a problem is where you start to see regressive steps backward, not toward progress. Where generations of Americans look ahead to their children being less well off than they, from a socioeconomic standpoint. But what about from a human dignity standpoint, where you're really asking yourselves, are we on a path toward greater democracy, or are we on a path toward greater concentration of power away from democracy? And that's where I'm given pause and where I'm made confused by current events. So as a media maker, I look at the situation and I see that we took the natural state of things, the bank, the school, the post office, the follies. We took that town square that we thought of, if you imagine sort of It's a Wonderful Life, Bedford Falls. And what's happened is it's been transformed now into a digital commons. Okay, so now you go to online banking, you get your news online, you get your entertainment digitally. The shopping you do, it's not the general store, it's an online set of factors. All of these conversions are happening. And yet it doesn't seem to me that we're carrying the regulatory instruments that it took centuries to develop with us into that digital future. So I interviewed Julian Assange a year or two ago. I broke him out of the embassy in London. I don't know if you know, but yes, I didn't break contemporary law, but I broke future law, because I broke him out of the embassy pixel by pixel. We took him as a hologram to the island of Nantucket, where they were doing one of those TED Talk type things, and we brought Julian in full body, sitting there with me. You can watch it online, and you can watch Jimmy Fallon make fun of us because we tried to high five in cyberspace, which was embarrassing at best. When I got him out, I said to him, what do you think of the digital commons? They say the digital world, it's like a Wild West. And he went, in cyberspace. He said, if what you mean by that is it's a lawless place where anything goes, the cyber world, he says, that's nonsense. It's one of the most tight law enforcement nets in the world. What it is a frontier only in the respect that there's no provision of rights for you. There's a tremendous, he says, if you get a traffic ticket in Albuquerque, they're going to know about it in Tallahassee moments later. Make no mistake. So the law enforcement aspect, the centralization of power, the centralization of local, state, federal, international power, that's doing just fine. It's actually more robust than ever. What hasn't come is the provision of an architecture of rights, the Magna Carta's child of today. And so I'm terribly frightened by most of the conversations that go on around us, because they aren't systemic, while the change we're experiencing is systemic. And I'm perfectly of the same mind that it is about doing it yourselves. It is about podcasts. It is about supporting local media. It is about local everything. It is about starting inside yourself with mindfulness and then letting that radiate outward into choices you make in your small community, larger circle, largest orbit, and ultimately the world. But we will get nowhere until we start to demand that, we now live in a world where we accept that we used to lick an envelope and close it, and we could assume that if it got to the other end and seemed closed, that nobody had read it. There isn't a person in this room today who won't send an email in the next day or so, and that email will be read. So we have just sleepwalked into a future in which it's okay to read our mail. When privacy is the cornerstone of democracy, how can you possibly have democracy? How can you possibly have protest or the effort to hold a system to account if the system can see you coming? How would we possibly have broken off from England? How would the South Africans possibly have had a revolution, the French and so forth, without secrecy? And so now privacy is gone? What next? And how do we possibly trim the fruit and the weeds away from this tree without getting down to the root system, which is being systemically, seismically altered in ways that I think we need to talk about as much as we need to talk about our own activities in the local space, which are of utmost importance. But simultaneous to that, how can we not be holding public officials to account who are, for example, antagonistic to whistleblowing? Can you imagine that a person shares information with the public of an unbelievable public sensitivity, and a politician like Ms. Clinton, for example, can want to put Edward Snowden in jail, and she can survive public scrutiny with that in mind? So I think seismically we need to think. We need to think where they're fracking the democracy.
We still have 6 minutes. Are we allowed to take a question or two? No. No?
Well, somebody can talk loud if somebody has a question.
Yeah,
we'll hear
come on.
it. Yes.
Wait. Here, the white shirt.
With all due respect, they franked democracy on 9/11. Thank you. We and all the press have gotten it wrong. I'm talking to 30 years of college.
We want a question.
I want a question. I want to know, would somebody debate somebody who knows something about me, for example?
Okay.
Would anybody debate me about the question of whether there was high government officials involved in that act?
All right, question number one. We're going to get 2 more questions. 2 more questions. 2 more over here. Another question on a different topic? Yep. Question?
And the question is, do you think it would be possible for this to connect to that?
Okay, that sounds like a question for the organizers. Last question here, different topic.
Could you talk about DRE voting machines?
That's like the black box, digital? Yeah. So 3 questions having to do with our democracy, really. 1, could this organization connect with the Whistleblower Summit? 2, would we on our programs or our various platforms engage in this discussion about 9/11? And 3, what about the authenticity of our voting systems? Yeah, the black box electronic voting. You've been making films about this kind of undermining of democracy that speak in a way to some of this.
For every question that we have, there's validity. Of course, there's validity to talking about what was known and what was engineered about 9/11. You'd have to be foolish to know the history of false flag operations from the Reichstag to Tonkin to elsewhere to imagine that 9/11 is an absolute shock and surprise, and you'd have to be naive to imagine that. To get into how deeply government officials were involved needs to be done so surgically so that it's worth its time, so that it doesn't get marginalized by just sort of having more heat than light. But it's a conversation that's beautiful to have because the public saw in that day whatever they saw, and they then watched an extraordinarily perverse manipulation of what happened into wars that have cost trillions in treasure and priceless in lives. And so I think the public more than ever understands, well, we don't just do everything right. And if we don't just do everything right, more than ever, I think conversations about what happened then are worth reaching back to and making the public rethink. Otherwise, that scab kind of covers over and it never really gets addressed. I think in terms of black box voting, I think I'm out of my expertise. The manipulation of voting is the same part of walking into a digital space unarmed by the protections of the past. You know, I'd like to have some licking of envelopes until we know how to make digital envelope sealage happen. And I think that's clearly not happening. And so we're just letting ourselves be vulnerable.
And I would add to that, one of the challenges, and it relates to the whistleblower story as well, one of the underreported stories that I think deserves more attention is the way that cross-sectoral movements are coming together, whether it is multiracial groups finally focusing on violence against people of color at the hands of police under the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it's the public union representatives supporting the Occupy movement. I think that when it comes to the question of black box voting, we have still to see that cross-sectoral connection between those worried about the electronic aspect of it and those worried about the denying voting rights aspect. There are two ways that our democracy are being undermined. In certain places, I think in Ohio, we saw some connecting. We saw both a challenge over voting rights and a challenge over the integrity of the vote in the digital form. But that's the sort of media that we need that would challenge people. Okay, well, you care about black box voting. Do you care about the voter exclusion laws? You care about the ID laws? Do you care about the electronics? And bring some of the science into the studio to talk about it. So that's sort of my very brief response. And I think unless you have a response, Jim, we might be out of time.
I'll say one thing about the woman who asked about the whistleblower conference. I think everybody should go to whistleblower conferences. Everything should be done to do two things about whistleblowing. It's in two stages. We have whistleblowers here, we have Kriyaku here, we have Binny here, we have Lawrence Wilkerson here, the extraordinary hero, Lawrence Wilkerson. It is so crucial that two things happen. The first step with the whistleblower is to make a hero of the whistleblower and make it known that it is the most elemental form of righteousness to blow a whistle on an unfair, illegal order, on an illegal law. But the second thing is to make whistleblowing no longer heroic, but simply normal, the normal thing that anyone would do, so that all of us in our walks of life that may be predatory, the ways in which we use products that hurt people, the way in which we are wearing clothing made by slaves, the way in which we are running power that is made on wars and on the backs of other smaller, less defended societies. All of that is stuff where we ourselves must whistleblow on ourselves, on our own lives. It ought to become normal to apply morality to the conduct of modern life. So start with heroes and then let's make us all normal.
And I think if Winona LaDuke was here, and I'm very sorry that she isn't, she would be saying that Native Americans and indigenous people are our original whistleblowers, and honor them. So thank you.